So XXXTentacion just passed away. Although I guess passed away isn't the right way to say it. I think passing away suggests a calmer, more natural way of dying. XXXTentacion was shot and killed in what appears to be some kind of robbery. And I have uh, made a review of X's 17 album a couple of months ago, and that came out of a desire for me to understand why he was so popular. When I have engaged with X's music, it came from a position of just being unsure of why he's so popular and trying to be empathetic to his side of his fandom and his all this stuff, because I felt like I was perhaps not fully grasping that side of hip hop to some degree. And I checked his album out, I listened to it, and I gave my thoughts on it in a review I made a couple of months ago, in which I mostly talked about what I perceived as the state of. But I mostly examined why I thought he was very popular and what that represented in terms of, or what that suggested in terms of how the youth culture was evolving and changing, and how hip hop in general was moving in a certain direction based on his popularity. And I talked about a lot of that in my review for his album. um, X, and I guess another reason why I was always very hesitant about listening to X was because of all the news I've been hearing about his purported criminal actions, whether that was beating up his girlfriend or whatever it was, or hurting some people, or getting into these fights and all of this stuff. And I guess I couldn't have it. I couldn't necessarily support someone at the time who I was very aware of all this stuff he was doing. But again, I didn't really think about how I was mostly hearing about this stuff from the perspective of what I was being presented to by the media and by what I read online, which may not necessarily have been the truth per se, but because of how conveniently packaged all of this stuff was, I didn't necessarily try to engage with those perceptions of mine in the same manner that I may have for other things I care more about. So I had these very strong negative perceptions of him, and I gave him a chance and listened to his album, and I found that within his music, he mostly talked about depression and suicide and his suicidal ideations and his thoughts, and he dedicates his music to his fans and people who suffer from these things. And it was a hard thing to kind of take apart or take together with his purported actions in real life when you hear his music, which personally I was not. I wouldn't listen to every day, or it wasn't necessarily my kind of music, but I appreciated what he had to say, and I appreciated how people were really just empathizing with him and resonating with his music. I think there's a problem when it's very often when people pass away that people or the public, they try to utmost present the recently deceased in the best of lights. And I've seen this in my own personal life as well as from what I've noticed online and with other communities of sorts and other people who have passed away over the last few years. And I think that this may cause a kind of a slippery slope in the sense in which one would think that living their life in any way that they want will be permissible to some extent, because at the end of their life they get some level of public redemption of sorts, or where people start to forgive them for what they did, and they get embraced by the community in a way that they may not have while they were alive because of the negative things that they've done when they were alive. And this is a big issue, I think, because if you live your life, you end up living your life in a way that is more disconnected from how things perhaps ought to be societal wise, because of this knowledge that at the end of the day you will be forgiven. And I don't necessarily know how to think about that, because obviously when you think of the arts, it's pretty well known that when someone dies, or after a number of years after someone dies, they get a kind of redemption in the same way that their art is the only things that become important to some degree, where you get many famous people over the last hundreds and hundreds of years who, if you read into their personal lives, they were kind of awful people, or they did a lot of awful things, or they did a lot of criminal activity, many of that becomes less important in the perspective of the modern day or the present day, when only the art survives and we end up just viewing or looking at the art itself. If you most people who we consider geniuses, or most people we consider uh, luminaries of different fields, when you read about their personal lives, they're often it feels very disillusioning when you see how imperfect they are, and not some are not even just imperfect, but they're kind of scary and mean and evil. A very easy example for me to talk about, because I'm a big fan of film, would be Alfred Hitchcock, who is beloved and always still seen as one of the greatest directors of all time, despite his abuse of women on his sets. Obviously, the most popular example would be his what happened with on the Bird set. But he has been known to be abusive of his female leading stars. But in retrospect, after several years after he has died, it doesn't seem to have hurt or hampered his legacy. In a similar way, how people kind of talk about Woody Allen today, and people don't feel comfortable seeing his films, but some people speculate that when he dies, he'll probably be forgiven for the possibility of what he did, because he hasn't even been proven to have done what he supposedly have done, but the possibility of it will be gone for some extent, I feel, because of the body of work that he was able to amass, for people who feel less disconnected to the time period. So this is quite common, and I'm quite curious about how X will be seen in the future. Will he be iconized in the same way that Biggie and Tupac were when they died in the mid-90s? I don't know. X is probably one of the most popular of his age group of rappers, and while one may argue that he needed to amass more a bigger body of work before he would be iconized in some way, Biggie had one album out, and I'm not even trying to compare their level of talent, because I definitely think that B.I.G. was such a skilled rapper in a way that X never really showed himself to be. But the level of popularity, I feel, for the younger generation, for people who be inspired by him, is undeniable, I think, as he is one of the most popular. And I think you could even argue that this is the peak. This might have been the peak of his popularity, although he didn't necessarily bleed into the mainstream in the same way that Biggie might have with some of his singles. He is very popular. Every kid knows who XXXTentacion is, and that will be something that will be moving forward in a way that you don't kind of get with many artists. So I'm curious to see how his legacy is going to unfold, and I haven't actually listened to his album this year. I'll probably give it a listen and give my thoughts on the musicality of it, and where hip-hop may seem to go for that, because I saw the Kanye West tweeted about him, and I remember I might have mentioned in the Kanye review that I felt that the opening of Ye reminded me of the opening of the X album, the 17, which I think on this newer album he also has some kind of intro, spoken word intro. So I thought, and to see that Ye apparently was influenced by that, or influenced by him, is unsurprising. But yeah, I mean, no one deserves to go out this way, and no one deserves to also be abused, which he seems to have done, or at least he apparently may have done. A lot of bad things happen in the world, and no one really deserves any of this stuff, I think. To get shot on the middle of the street while you're 20 years old, in the time when he seems to be outwardly outspoken about how he wants to change and how he tries to donate to all these charities. So in a time in his life where he may have been trying to improve himself, it's unfortunate that this happened. So rest in peace for him. But also, he did a lot of awful things which shouldn't be replicated, and I don't think one should ever come to the way of thinking in which we are fully aware of this level of public redemption that allows us to keep doing the things that we do, because one day people will forgive us anyway. Be decent people even when you're alive. And that's all I have to say. I'll listen to this album. The question mark, I don't know how to say it, question. Yeah.